If you've been a Christian for a while, probably one of the objections you hear from other people is they say, well, you guys as Christians, you guys claim that the Word of God, that it's literal and that you ought to obey everything that's written in there. But they say, how come you guys kind of pick and choose the laws that you want to obey? Might go something like this. Well, you tell me that I need to obey the laws that come from the Bible, the rules from the Bible that deal with my sexuality, but how about the rules that talk about not eating shellfish or pork? How about the rules that talk about other things like that, some of these weird things that you find in the law about not wearing clothes that are made out of two different kinds of fabric? I mean, they might say something to you like, I know that shirt you're wearing right now, it's made out of cotton and polyester, so you're disobeying God's law. Or they might say, I saw you down at Chili's the other day eating this nice rack of baby back ribs. So why is it that you can obey some of the laws that we find in the rules in there, but not some of the others? And I think most of us, we don't want to deal with that. So I'm not sure that secretly, deep down inside, that sometimes we really hope someone else won't ask us a question like that, right? And maybe even in our own lives, we struggle with some of those things. I mean, why is it that we follow some of the laws that we find in God's Word and others that we don't really seem to care about much in today's culture? And so those are things that I think are real for us. And so this morning, what I want to do is hopefully to give you some tools that you can use to address those things with other people, but maybe even more importantly, that you can understand, how do we take some of those really weird Old Testament laws? Let's face it, some of them are pretty weird, aren't they? How do we take and how do we apply them in our lives? How do we live by them? Now, as we've been going through the Old Testament this year, we've kind of moved the story along by looking at the lives of the important figures that we find there. We've looked at people like Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham and some other people like that. So this next couple of weeks, we're going to kind of take a break from that. And instead of looking at the lives of people, we'll come back to that in a couple of weeks, I want to look at a couple of the elements that were an important part of the life of the nation of Israel. So this week we're going to take a look at the giving of the law, and then next week we're going to look at the tabernacle. And then, as I say, in a couple of weeks we'll get back to looking at the lives of some of the important characters there that we find there. Now, I don't know about you, but as we met together on Monday morning, we began to look at some of these passages, we realized just how much that our view of the giving of the law is influenced a lot by things like movies that we see, you know, where Moses goes up onto the mountain and gets the law. Perhaps some of your views about the giving of the law have even been influenced by a movie like this one.
Moses went to the mountain, and God spoke unto him.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, I hear you. A deaf man could hear you.
What?
Nothing, finished. Forget it.
Oh, Lord, why have you chosen me? What would you have me do for you?
I shall give you my laws, and you shall take them unto the people.
Yes, Lord. Lord, I shall give these laws unto thy people. Hear me. Oh, hear me. All pay heed. The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 15. Wait. 10 commandments for all to obey.
Now, I guess most of us realize that's probably not how it really happened, but I think in our minds we have this picture of how the giving of the law occurred that is much more simple than what really happened. I mean, I don't know about you, but I always had this idea that what happened was Moses just went up on the mountain, that God gave him the law, he comes back down with these tablets, and then he gets down there, he finds the golden calf, and he throws down the tablets in anger, and God sends him back up and gets 2 more. And all that just took like, maybe a few minutes or something like this. It all happened over a short period of time. But what we find if we look in the Scriptures is actually it was a much more complex process of the giving of the law. Do you realize that it starts in Exodus chapter 19 and it goes all the way through chapter 34? Now, don't worry, I'm not going to read all those chapters today. I'm going to try to kind of give you the Reader's Digest version of what happens there. In Exodus chapter 19, we find that Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, the same place where he had met God earlier, where he saw God there in that burning bush. And there on the mountain, God confirms the covenant that he had made with his people, the promise that he had made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that he was going to make his people into a great people and that all the nations on the earth were going to be blessed through his people. And God said to them, he says, you know what? If you will follow my commands, if you'll do what I instruct you, then I will be your treasured possession. And all the people said, yeah, God, we will do that. We will obey everything that you're going to tell us. So Moses goes up on the mountain and he gets the laws. He gets the 10 Commandments. But he gets a whole lot of other laws in addition to the 10 Commandments. He gets laws there about things like slaves, about making restitution, about how they were to live within this community that God had created. And he gets all these laws, and then Moses finally, after getting all these laws, he finally comes down the mountain. And that brings us to Exodus chapter 24, which is the passage that we're going to look at this morning. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and take them out. Turn to Exodus chapter 24 this morning. Exodus chapter 24, I'm going to begin reading in verse 1. It says, Then he said to Moses, Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. So God says to Moses, he says, okay, I want you to gather all the people. I want you to bring Aaron, I want you to bring their sons, Nadab and Abihu. I want you to bring the 70 elders, and I want you to come to the foot of the mountain, and I want you to worship. But he says, only Moses gets to actually come up and to be near me. He continues there. It says, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, All the words that the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt sacrifices and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So what happens here is they gather together for worship. And what's the first thing that Moses does? He recites to the people orally all these commands that God had given to them. And what do the people do? The people say, they respond. They say, yes, we're going to obey everything that God told you to tell us. Just as an aside, there's a great picture of worship here, isn't there? We've always talked about how worship is this idea of revelation and response. Perfect picture of it here, right? Moses brings the revelation of God to the people, and the people respond. They say, yeah, we'll obey everything that was said there. So after the people do that, remember now this is the second time that they've promised God that they'll obey everything in the law. Now Moses, it says that he writes down the law. It's called the Book of the Covenant, and he writes it down. And then they go through this elaborate ceremony to ratify this covenant that God has made with them. It goes all the way back to what God had told Moses earlier on the mountain, that if you'll obey this, then I'll be your God, you'll be my treasured people. And we've talked before about how in the Old Testament the covenants were ratified. They would split animals in half and they would walk between them. And that's kind of the picture you get here. The animals are killed. But this time, instead of just walking through them, the people ratify the covenant in a different way. So So Moses writes all this stuff down, and after he's written it all down, it tells us now he takes this book of the covenant, he reads it to the people, and for the third time now the people say, yes, we will obey everything that's written in here. And they seal the covenant as Moses takes some of the blood and sprinkles it on the people. Certainly a picture that we're going to see later in the New Testament of the new covenant that comes through the blood of Jesus Christ. So they have this worship service. Now let me pick up in verse 9 here. It says, Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up. And they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. Now I got to tell you here, we could spend our whole time trying to figure out just what they saw here in verse 9. And if you'd like to do that, that's probably a great exercise. That'd be a great topic if you want to study it. I'll give you a clue. Go to Ezekiel, go to Revelation. You'll find some descriptions that are almost exactly the same here. But whatever it was that they saw there, they saw some aspect of God. And it says, then they gathered together and they ate and they drank. They had a meal together. And you can't really read that without thinking of the Passover supper, can you? Where Jesus sits down with his disciples and he eats a meal with them. And at the end of the meal, he takes this cup of wine and he says, I'm going to establish a new covenant with you. Not a covenant that's made with the blood of animals, but the covenant that's going to come from my own blood. So 3 times now. 3 times Moses has gone up. He's got these commands. He's got the commands. He's given them to the people. The people said that we'll obey. And after all this happens now, after all that, does God call Moses back up to the mountain again? And he says, Moses, I want you to come back up, and I'm going to give you some tablets that have the laws written on them. And we all know what happens next. Moses goes back up there, and he's up there for a while. God doesn't immediately just write down the commandments on the tablets. He gives Moses a whole bunch more commands. He gives him commands about the building of the tabernacle. We're going to look at some of that next week. He gives them commands about the garments for the priests. We looked at some of that last week. He gives instructions about how the priests were to be consecrated. And so Moses is up there for 40 days getting all these commands. And when he finally comes back down, he realizes that the people have gotten, they've gotten impatient. They made this golden calf. And so Moses takes and he throws down the tablets. He's angry over what the people have done. It tells us there that God commands the Levites to go through the community and kill 3,000 people. And it's only after Moses intercedes on behalf of the people that God stops his wrath. But God tells the people, you're going to have to leave this place and you're going to go to Sinai. You're going to go to this place that I'm going to give to you, the place that I've promised. But before you do that, he says, Moses, I want you to come back up to the mountain. I want you to cut 2 new tablets, and I'm going to write the laws on those tablets once more. So this whole process is much more complicated and complex than we ever think that it would be. But the idea here is that this is all wrapped around the covenant that God made with his people. And I think it's that covenant that becomes the key to understanding how it is that we take these Old Testament laws, some of them, frankly, that seem really weird and strange, and how do we apply them in our lives? We have to understand the covenant. We have to understand the purpose for which God gave the law. Now, we're going to see in a little bit later on that God certainly gave the law to his people because it was good for them. It protected them in many ways. But I'm convinced that the main reason that he gave it to him is wrapped up in this covenant, because what does God want to do? He wants to create this unique people for himself. He wants them to live a life that's going to be different than the people around them. So the thing that I want us to see this morning from the giving of the law is this, that God wants his people to live a unique life that sets them apart from the surrounding culture. That's what God wanted to do with Israel. That's why He gives them the law. He gives them the law because He wants them to live differently than all the people around Him. He doesn't want them to be influenced by the culture around them, because they're about to go into a land that's full of ungodly pagan people that serve all these different gods. And He says, I'm going to give you these laws because I want you to be unique. I want you to be set apart. And guess what? That is exactly what God still wants from His people today. He wants us not to be like the culture around us, but to be unique, to be different. So that when people look at our lives, that they see there's something different about us. And what that tells us here is that the question we shouldn't be asking is, well, how much of the Old Testament can I just ignore and still be okay with God? No, the question ought to be, how can I take these Old Testament laws and use them in my life and apply them in my life in a way that helps me to live a life that's unique and set apart from the culture around me? Or as Jesus put it, how can I take these Old Testament commands and use them in a way that I can be in the world but not of the world? And I think that's really the purpose for which God gives the laws. And if we'll keep that in mind, that will help us answer some of these critics that say, well, why do you look at a base part of the law and not the other part? It'll help us deal with our own doubts about that as well. Now, in developing the principles that we can use to do that, it's really helpful to think of the Old Testament law, that it contains really three different kinds of laws, or three different aspects to the Old Testament law. The first part was the moral law. That's the Ten Commandments, or the moral law. And the moral law is this idea about how we're to live. And really, the moral law really was intended to apply to all mankind for all time. And really, up till fairly recently in this country, even those who were not believers in Jesus Christ would pretty much accept most of the moral law, wouldn't they? I mean, most people in most cultures think it's wrong to kill someone. They think it's wrong to steal from someone. Unfortunately, over time, what's happened is that even our culture here in the United States has become much more accepting of violating the moral law. But that moral law was intended to apply to all people for all times. And certainly I don't think that any Christian would argue with the moral law and say, well, we really aren't subject to that anymore. The second part of the law is what we would call the civil law. And this governed how the people of Israel were to live in their community. It was a law that was intended to apply to a certain people at a certain time. It was the law that was going to guide Israel when they went into the Promised Land and they had all these other people living around them. He was going to give them some instructions for how they were to live in that culture at that time. So that law was really limited to one culture at one time. The third part of the law is what we would call the ceremonial law. And this was the law of worship for Israel. It includes the whole sacrificial system. It dealt with how the people were to deal with sin in their midst. And again, that was a particular law that applied to the nation of Israel for a particular time. And I think it's helpful to look at these distinctions when we begin to determine, how am I supposed to take the law of the Old Testament and apply it to my life? Now, I got to tell you, these three categories, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You're going to find some laws that kind of overlap and fit in there. But this can be helpful to us as we begin to understand, how do I take the Old Testament law and apply it to my life? So let's look at that. Let's look at this morning, how do I take this Old Testament law and apply it as a disciple of Jesus Christ? And I'm going to give you kind of three categories of law and how we can take and apply. The first category are those things from the Old Testament that are reaffirmed in the New Testament. And if that happens, those laws should be binding and valid on our life. There's a lot of those. Most of the moral law kind of fits into that category. I mean, think about it. If you take every one of the 10 Commandments, you will find that in some way, at some point, Jesus reaffirmed those 10 Commandments. Probably the best example you find of that is in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus not only reaffirmed them, he made them even broader. So you see him say time after time, you have heard that it was said, do not murder. But I say to you, don't even be angry with your brother. So Jesus takes the moral law. He reaffirms it over and over again in the New Testament. So if there's a principle in the Old Testament, a law in the Old Testament that's reaffirmed in the New Testament, then it ought to apply. And I don't think anyone would argue with that. I mean, that makes sense. It's in the New Testament. We ought to follow it. How about if there was a law in the Old Testament that's actually contradicted in the New Testament, or that's set aside in the New Testament? And when that happens, then we find that we're no longer subject to that law, that it's no longer binding or valid in our lives. Dave, if you can go to the next point. There, thanks. This is a lot of the civil law, a lot of the ceremonial law certainly fits into this category. God gave it for a certain period of time. And then it was overturned specifically in the New Testament. Probably the best example I can think of is the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. Because what happened is there were some Jewish Christians that had got together and they were trying to say that if you wanted to become a Christian, you first had to become a Jew and you had to follow the law, the Old Testament law of circumcision. And so what happens? The early church leaders, who were all Jews, Peter and Paul and Barnabas and James, they get together at this council and they decide, no, you don't have to be circumcised in order to be a believer in Jesus Christ. At the same time, they also reaffirmed some things that were there. They said you still shouldn't still shouldn't be involved with idols. You shouldn't eat the blood in the meat, some other things like that. But they specifically came and they set aside this law about circumcision. And again, we find a lot of the sacrificial laws were set aside too. Why? Because Jesus came and He fulfilled the sacrificial law. Here's what it says about that in Hebrews chapter 10. It says, "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. When He said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings, these are offered according to the law. Then He added, behold, I have come to do your will." He does away with the first order, so it's saying Jesus did away with this sacrificial system to establish the second. And by that, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. So what it says, Jesus came across, He set aside that whole sacrificial system. And doesn't that seem to be confirmed by God? Because guess what happens in 70 AD? The temple is destroyed. And the people can no longer go there to make the sacrifices that they've made all this time. It's as if God's reaffirming what the writer of Hebrews has written here about the fact that Jesus set all that aside. A lot of the dietary laws that are in the Old Testament, they've been set aside in the New Testament. And so we no longer are subject. Those are no longer binding and valid in our life. And again, I don't think too many people would argue with that, especially the people who don't want to obey the Old Testament. They go, yeah, you're right. Man, if it's set aside, we don't need to obey that. But let's face it, not all the laws in the Old Testament fit neatly into one of those two categories, do they? There's a lot of things that aren't addressed in the New Testament at all, those Old Testament laws, those really weird ones. And so I'm going to suggest to you a procedure that we ought to follow when that happens. And here's the process that we can apply. The first thing that we have to do is that we have to identify general principles. Now we know that God, He gave the Old Testament law for the good of the people. Dave, if you can go ahead and go to that next slide for me. And the first point up there. Thanks. So we know that God gave the law for the good of the people. Some of the dietary laws He gave to protect them from disease because they didn't have refrigeration like we have today. A lot of the laws He gave to protect the dignity of people. People that couldn't stand up for themselves in that culture. People like slaves and women and poor people. And a lot of those laws were given to protect their dignity. And so what we can do with almost every law that we find in the Old Testament is we can go back and we can find the reason that God gave it. What's the principle behind God giving that particular law? I'm going to give you an example in a minute of how we can do that. So the first thing we want to do is to go back and identify these principles. Second thing we want to do is to see if these principles then are confirmed in the New Testament. Again, I'm talking about the principles. And here's what I'm going to suggest to you, that because these are timeless principles, in almost every case, even though the specific law may not be reaffirmed in the New Testament, I'm pretty sure in most cases you're going to find that the principle is found in the New Testament. So you find the principle. And then the third thing that you do is you take and you apply that principle to the specific situation that you're in. You look at the principle. You don't deal so much with the letter of the law, but the principle that's behind that law, and you put it into practice in that specific situation. I'm going to give you a practical example of how you can do an example, because I know this might be still somewhat kind of esoteric and theoretical. So here's one of the laws that you find in Deuteronomy chapter 22. It says this: when you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring the guilt of blood upon your house if anyone should fall from it. So here's the question. If you don't have a parapet on your house, are you violating God's law? Now, I'm in good shape. I have a flat roof on my house, and I have a parapet around my house, so I'm good. But if you have like a tile roof or something, you're probably violating God's law, right? Because you don't have a parapet around there. Well, that's kind of silly, obviously. So the idea is, what's the principle behind this? Why would God give a law about building a parapet? I mean, who cares how you build your house? Well, God tells us right here exactly why. I mean, back in that day, the people, their rooftops were part of their living space. And if you didn't build a parapet around that rooftop, what would happen? Somebody that was up there could fall off and get hurt. So the overall principle is that God wants you to take care to make sure that when people come into your house, your family, neighbors, other people, that they don't get hurt. Would you agree that that's kind of the general principle there? So I think about, okay, where do I find that principle in the New Testament? Well, I could probably find it in certain places, but let me just suggest to you a real simple one. Love your neighbor. I mean, when your neighbor comes over to your house, do you want to make sure that your house is set up so that they aren't going to get harmed physically when they come over there? I think that's a practical example. Every time I think about that, I'm reminded the first church I pastored, I went to visit a lady that was in our church. And she lived out on the south side of town here. She lived in a mobile home, and this lady was a hoarder. And so when you went into her house, I mean, there was just stuff all over the place. So I went to visit her one day, and as I walked in, I realized that she is on oxygen, and she's smoking a cigarette at the same time. And I'm thinking, I hope I get out of this place alive. And I got to tell you, I'm not so sure that that particular lady was really understanding the purpose of this law, or this idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. We could take it even further, couldn't we? Not only physical harm that we could do to a neighbor, we could do emotional harm, right? By the words that we say. So we don't want to say things that would tear them down, but the Bible tells us to only speak things that are useful for building other people up. So you see how you can take that principle and you can apply it to the specific situation that you're in. And when I apply the Old Testament law like that, then I think I have a pretty good argument to make to people that are asking me, how do you take some laws and apply them and not others? Now, I'm going to be really honest with you. There's some people out there that don't really care about that. They just want to argue with you. They just want to prove that Christianity is wrong, and nothing you say is ever going to change their mind, and that's fine. But what I'm really more concerned with this morning is that you would develop this mindset in your own life that would help you to take these Old Testament laws and apply them in a way that allows you to live a life that's unique and that's set apart from the culture around us. Because that was the purpose of the law in the first place. So how do we make this really practical? How do we make sure that you're really able to do this? I'm going to give you some homework this morning. Because here's what I'm afraid will happen otherwise. If you just leave here now and you say, Pat, that was really good, but by tomorrow morning you'll probably forget everything I said this morning. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go ahead this week and I want you to pick out 3 Old Testament laws. I want you to, first of all, find one law that's confirmed in the New Testament. You should be able to do that in about 3 seconds. That'll be pretty easy to do. I gave you some clues this morning. Just go to the Sermon on the Mount. You'll find a bunch of them there. And then think about, okay, how can I apply that in my life? How can I take and apply that life? Then find one commandment that's in the Old Testament that's overturned or set aside in the New Testament. And again, look at some of the ceremonial laws, look at some of the civic laws. You'll be able to find some of those that are specifically overturned, some to do with dietary restrictions. And again, once you find that, guess what? You're good on that one. You don't have to do anything else with it because you don't have to obey it, right? And then third, here's going to be the hard part. I want you to go back and find one of those really weird Old Testament laws that just doesn't make sense. And go through the process that I just talked about now. Here's a couple that I might give you as a suggestion. How about the one that you're not to plant two different kinds of seeds in the same field? Or how about the one that you're not to wear clothing with two different kinds of material? Or if you're really adventuresome, how about the command not to have tattoos? Some of you will be really interested in that, right, Ryan? Derek, a few others. I want you to do that because I think if you'll go through this process, you'll find out that some people who try to make that kind of a black and white thing to say that, you can't be a Christian and have tattoos, if you'll go through this process and really understand the reason and the purpose behind that and then apply that with some New Testament principles, you'll be able to come away with an understanding. So will you do that this week? I think